The laughter stopped the moment Clara Whitmore stepped into the banquet hall alone. Every head turned, not because she looked out of place, though her simple gray dress did stand apart from the silk and jewels around her. They turned because everyone already knew where she belonged, and it was not here, among lords and ladies who measured worth by bloodline and land. She kept her chin high and walked toward the far end of the long table, where a single empty chair waited for her, tucked beside a cold, drafty window. Her cousin Eleanor Grant caught her eye from across the room and looked away quickly, as if Clara were a stain she hoped no one would notice. Eleanor had invited her out of obligation, nothing more. Family blood demanded an invitation be sent, but family pride demanded distance once it was accepted. Clara sat down. The chair scraped against the polished floor, and the sound seemed to echo louder than it should have. A few guests near her exchanged glances and lowered their voices, though not low enough that she could not hear the word poor relation drift across the table like smoke. She did not flinch. She had learned long ago that flinching only fed the appetite of people who enjoyed watching others break. At the head of the hall, seated beneath a golden chandelier, Earl Nathaniel Ashford watched the entire scene unfold without a word. He had watched it before, at other banquets, in other halls. The same performance, the same cruelty dressed up as manners. Tonight, something about the quiet dignity in the young woman's posture struck him differently. She did not beg for acceptance. She simply endured, the way a person endures weather they cannot control. His mother, Lady Margaret Ashford, sat beside him, speaking to a duchess about an upcoming wedding. She did not notice her son rise from his chair. Nathaniel walked the length of the hall. Conversations dimmed as he passed, one table at a time, until the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see where the Earl of Ashford was going. He stopped beside the empty seat next to Clara, the one no one had bothered to sit in because it faced the draft, and sat farthest from the honored guests. He pulled it out and sat down. Clara turned, startled, her fork frozen halfway to her plate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence in the hall had become something almost physical, pressing against every guest who dared not look away. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm, as though he had not just upended the entire order of the room. "I hope you do not mind the company." She studied him, searching his face for mockery, the kind she had grown used to expecting from men of his rank. She found none. "I do not mind," she said carefully, "though I imagine half this hall does." A faint smile crossed his lips. "Half this hall minds most things I do. I have long since stopped counting their objections." Whispers spread through the room like a struck match catching dry grass. Lady Margaret turned, finally noticing her son's absence at the head table, and her eyes found him instantly, seated beside a woman she did not recognize. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, the way a hawk's gaze sharpens the moment it spots movement in the grass below. Eleanor, watching from 3 seats down, went pale. She had spent the entire evening trying to distance herself from her cousin, and now the most powerful man in the room had chosen to sit beside the very person Eleanor wished to forget existed. Clara felt the weight of every stare, but strangely, sitting beside the Earl made the weight easier to bear rather than heavier. She was still an outsider, still the woman in the plain gray dress, but for the first time that evening, she was not alone in it. "May I ask why you did that?" she said quietly, once the murmurs around them softened into background noise. "You do not know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you walked into a room full of people who decided your worth before you spoke a single word. I have watched that happen more times than I care to admit, and tonight I decided I was tired of only watching." She did not answer right away. She had spent years building walls around herself, walls made from every slight, every whispered insult, every door closed before she could knock. It was not easy to trust kindness when cruelty had been so much more familiar. "That is a generous reason," she finally said, "though I wonder if it will cost you more than you expect." He glanced toward his mother, whose stare had not softened, then back to Clara. "Everything costs something," he said. "I have simply decided some things are worth the price." Down the table, a young man named Vincent Hale leaned toward another guest, his eyes fixed on Clara with unusual interest. He had heard her name earlier that evening, mentioned briefly by a solicitor discussing an old estate dispute. He had not paid much attention then. He was paying close attention now. "Who is she?" Vincent asked quietly. "Clara Whitmore," the guest answered. "Cousin to Eleanor Grant. No fortune to speak of as far as anyone knows." Vincent's eyes lingered on her a moment longer, calculating something the rest of the room could not see. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to his companion. The banquet continued around them, servants moving between tables with trays of food and wine, musicians playing softly in the corner, but the true center of attention remained fixed on the far end of the table, where an earl and an overlooked young woman sat speaking as though the rest of the world had faded away. Clara found herself relaxing, if only slightly. Nathaniel asked about her life, and she answered honestly, without exaggeration or apology. She told him about her father, a modest merchant who had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind debts rather than riches. She told him about the small cottage she shared with her aunt, the quiet days spent mending clothes and keeping accounts, the banquet invitations that came rarely and meant even less. He listened, truly listened, in a way she was not accustomed to from people of his station. Most nobles asked questions only to fill silence before returning to conversations that mattered more to them. Nathaniel seemed genuinely interested in the answers. "You speak plainly," he said after a while. "Most people in this hall speak in half-truths, hoping to impress rather than to be understood." "Plain speech is all I have ever had the luxury of affording," she replied. "I was never taught the art of pretending." "It suits you," he said, "more than you may realize." Across the hall, Lady Margaret rose from her seat and made her way toward them, her steps measured and deliberate, the way a general approaches a battlefield they intend to win. Conversations quieted further as she passed, guests sensing the tension gathering like storm clouds before a summer squall. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice cool and pleasant on the surface, though Clara could hear the iron beneath it. "Will you not return to the head table? Our guests have been asking for you." "I am quite comfortable here, Mother," he answered, his tone respectful but unmoving. "Perhaps you might join us instead." Lady Margaret's gaze shifted to Clara, sweeping over her plain dress, her unadorned hair, her lack of jewelry, cataloging every detail with the precision of someone accustomed to judging worth at a glance. "And who is this young woman?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer did not matter to her. "Clara Whitmore," Nathaniel said before Clara could speak for herself. "A guest at tonight's banquet, same as everyone else in this hall." "A guest," Lady Margaret repeated, the word carrying a weight far heavier than its meaning. "Of course. How wonderful that we welcome guests from every corner of society these days." The comment landed exactly as intended, a quiet blade wrapped in polite words. Clara felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her expression steady, refusing to give Lady Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. "It is a fine banquet," Clara said evenly. "Thank you for the invitation, though I understand it was extended through my cousin rather than by your own hand. I will not overstay whatever welcome that affords me." For a brief moment, something flickered across Lady Margaret's face, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect for the quiet steel in Clara's response. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the same composed mask she wore for every social occasion. "We shall see," Lady Margaret said simply, before turning and walking back toward the head table, her steps just as measured as before, though something in her posture had shifted, as though she were already calculating her next move. Nathaniel watched his mother go, then turned back to Clara. "I apologize for that," he said. "She is protective, sometimes to a fault." "You need not apologize for her," Clara said. "I have faced worse than cold words from strangers. I imagine I will face worse again before the night ends." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You carry yourself like someone who has survived a great deal," he said. "I find myself wanting to know the rest of your story." Before she could answer, a shadow fell across the table. Vincent Hale had made his way toward them, a practiced smile fixed on his face, the kind of smile Clara had learned to distrust the moment she saw it. "Forgive the interruption," he said smoothly, his eyes moving briefly to Nathaniel before settling on Clara. "I could not help but notice you from across the hall." "Vincent Hale, at your service." "Clara Whitmore," she replied, offering only her name, nothing more. "A pleasure," he said, his smile widening. "I understand you are cousin to Eleanor Grant. I have long admired your family, though we have never had the occasion to speak." Something about his tone felt rehearsed, as though he had prepared this introduction long before walking toward her, waiting for the right moment to deliver it. Clara could not name the unease that settled in her chest, but it was there nonetheless, quiet and persistent, like a draft slipping beneath a closed door. Nathaniel's expression had shifted subtly, his easy warmth replaced by something more guarded, as he studied Vincent with the careful attention of a man accustomed to spotting insincerity beneath polished manners. "I do not believe we have met," Nathaniel said, his voice pleasant but firm. "Vincent Hale, was it?" "Indeed, my lord," Vincent said, offering a slight bow. "I have only recently returned to the county. Family matters, you understand." "Of course," Nathaniel replied. though his tone suggested he understood far less than he was letting on, and intended to learn more before the evening ended. Vincent lingered a moment longer, his eyes flickering once more to Clara with an expression she could not quite place, something between curiosity and calculation. Then he offered a final bow and returned to his seat, though Clara could feel his attention lingering long after he had walked away. The music shifted to a slower tune, and couples began moving toward the open floor at the center of the hall, forming pairs for the evening's first dance. Clara had no expectation of joining them. Women like her did not dance at banquets like this. They watched from the edges, invisible unless someone chose to notice them, and even then, only briefly. Nathaniel rose from his chair and extended his hand. "Would you care to dance?" he asked. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath once more. Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt that might suggest he had realized the magnitude of what he was offering. She found none. "I do not know the steps well," she admitted quietly. "I have never had reason to learn them." "Then we shall learn together," he said. "I promise not to judge your missteps if you promise not to judge mine." Slowly, she placed her hand in his and rose from her chair. As they walked toward the dance floor, every eye in the hall followed them, whispers rising and falling like waves against a shore. Lady Margaret watched from the head table, her expression unreadable, while Eleanor stared with an expression somewhere between horror and disbelief. Vincent Hale watched too, though his eyes held something colder, something calculating, as though he were already rearranging the pieces of a plan only he could see. The music began, and for the first time that evening, Clara Whitmore was not the woman sitting alone in the shadows. She was the woman standing in the light, and whatever came next, she would face it with her head held high. The dance ended, but the conversations it started did not. By the time Clara returned to her seat, breathless and flushed from the unfamiliar steps, the entire banquet hall had reorganized itself around a single fact. The Earl of Ashford had chosen her, if only for one dance, and choices like that did not go unnoticed in a world built on careful alliances and calculated marriages. Eleanor found her moments later, pulling her aside near a quiet alcove away from the crowd. Her face was tight with worry, though Clara could not tell if it was worry for her cousin or worry for herself. "What are you doing?" Eleanor whispered sharply. "Do you understand what you have just done? Lady Margaret will never forgive this. You have made an enemy of the most powerful woman in the county in a single evening." "I have done nothing but sit where I was seated and dance when I was asked," Clara replied evenly. "I did not force the Earl's attention. He offered it freely." Eleanor's eyes darted toward the head table, where Lady Margaret sat in quiet conversation with another guest, her posture rigid despite her composed expression. "He is only doing this to prove a point," Eleanor said. "Men like him grow bored of ordinary comforts and seek out novelty. You are a novelty tonight, Clara, nothing more." The words stung more than Clara wanted to admit, though she kept her face still. "Perhaps you are right," she said quietly. "Or perhaps you simply cannot imagine a world where someone looks at me and sees more than you have ever allowed yourself to see." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, something like guilt flickering across her expression, before she turned and walked away without another word. Clara stood alone in the alcove for a moment, gathering herself. The evening had already unraveled every expectation she carried when she first stepped into the hall. She had come expecting invisibility. Instead, she had found herself at the center of a storm she had never asked to create. When she returned to the main hall, Nathaniel was waiting near the refreshment table, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He offered her one as she approached. "You look troubled," he observed. "It has been a troubling evening," she admitted, accepting the glass. "Though not entirely in the way I expected." He studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Your cousin spoke to you," he said. "It was not a question." "She did," Clara said. "She fears I have made an enemy of your mother." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "My mother has strong opinions about many things," he said. "She does not always share them kindly. I am sorry if her words tonight caused you pain." "You need not apologize on her behalf," Clara said. "Though I confess, I do not entirely understand why you have chosen to spend your evening beside someone who brings you nothing but trouble with your own family." He considered the question seriously, as though it deserved more than a quick answer. "Because trouble that comes from doing the right thing is trouble worth having," he said finally. "I have spent years surrounded by people who tell me what I wish to hear, who flatter and perform and calculate their every word for advantage. Tonight, for the first time in longer than I can remember, someone spoke to me plainly, without artifice. That is not trouble, Clara, that is relief. Before she could respond, a familiar voice interrupted them. "My lord," Vincent Hale said, approaching with his easy smile once more fixed in place. "I wonder if I might borrow Miss Whitmore for a brief conversation. A matter concerning her family, actually." Clara felt the unease return, sharper this time. "My family," she repeated. "What matter would that be?" Vincent's smile did not waver, though something behind his eyes shifted, calculating and careful. "Perhaps somewhere more private would suit the discussion better," he said. "I would not wish to bore the Earl with matters of little consequence to him." Nathaniel's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Whatever concerns Miss Whitmore's family," he said. "You may speak freely here. I have no objection to hearing it." Vincent's smile flickered, just for a moment, before he recovered his composure. "Of course," he said smoothly. "It is a small matter, truly. I had the pleasure of knowing your late father, Miss Whitmore." "Edward Whitmore, was it? A fine merchant, well respected in his trade. I merely wish to offer my condolences, though it seems the moment has passed for private conversation." Clara studied him carefully, searching for the truth behind his words. Something did not sit right, though she could not name exactly what. "My father passed 3 years ago," she said. "It is kind of you to remember him, though I do not recall him ever mentioning your name." "We were acquainted through business circles," Vincent said smoothly. "Nothing more. I simply wished to pay my respects." He offered a slight bow and retreated back into the crowd, though Clara noticed he did not return to his original seat. Instead, he lingered near the edges of the hall, watching, waiting, though for what she could not say. "That was strange," Clara murmured once he was out of earshot. Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes following Vincent's retreat with quiet suspicion. "I do not know the man," he said, "but I intend to learn more about him before the night is over. Something about his manner does not sit well with me." The banquet continued around them, the orchestra shifting into another slow melody, guests drifting between conversations and dances, the earlier scandal of the Earl's chosen company slowly folding into the general hum of the evening. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted permanently. Clara could feel it, the way one feels a storm approaching long before the first drop of rain falls. Lady Margaret approached again as the evening wore on, though this time she did not address Clara directly. Instead, she spoke to her son in low, urgent tones, though Clara caught fragments of the conversation despite herself. "You cannot be serious about this," Lady Margaret said quietly. "She is nothing, Nathaniel. No fortune, no title, no connections worth mentioning. The family cannot afford scandal, not with the estate's finances as precarious as they currently stand." "I have made no declarations, Mother," Nathaniel replied, his voice equally low but firm. "I have simply chosen to treat a guest with the courtesy she deserves. If that offends you, I am sorry, but I will not apologize for basic decency." "Decency," Lady Margaret repeated, her voice sharpening. "Decency will not settle our debts or secure our position among families who still hold power in this county. You know our circumstances better than anyone, Nathaniel. We cannot afford sentiment." Clara looked away, pretending not to have heard, though the words settled heavily in her chest. She had not realized the Ashford family carried financial troubles of their own, hidden beneath silk and chandeliers and grand banquet halls. It explained, perhaps, the sharpness in Lady Margaret's tone, the desperation beneath her composed exterior. When Nathaniel returned to her side, his expression carried a weight it had not held before. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "My mother speaks from worry, not cruelty, though I understand it rarely feels that way to the person receiving her words." "I do not need your family's approval," Clara said gently. "I never expected it, and I do not require it now. Whatever kindness you have shown me tonight, I accept it for what it is, nothing more, nothing less." He looked at her for a long moment, something softening in his expression. "You ask for very little," he said. "Most people in this hall would ask for a great deal more, given the opportunity." "Perhaps that is because I have learned not to expect much," she replied honestly. "It spares me disappointment." The evening stretched onward, filled with music and conversation, though an undercurrent of tension remained beneath every exchange. Vincent Hale continued to watch from the shadows, his earlier explanation about knowing Clara's father sitting uneasily in her mind. Something about the timing, the careful way he had approached, the mention of her father specifically rather than any other topic, suggested his interest ran deeper than simple courtesy. Near midnight, as guests began preparing to depart, Nathaniel walked Clara toward the entrance hall where carriages waited to carry guests home through the cold night air. "I hope tonight has not caused you more trouble than comfort," he said as they stood near the grand doorway. "Trouble seems to follow me regardless of what I do," Clara said with a faint smile. Tonight, at least, it came with good company. He smiled at that, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes that had been absent during his earlier conversation with his mother. May I call on you? He asked. Properly, with your aunt's permission, so that whatever comes next is not merely the product of one strange evening. Clara hesitated, weighing the offer against everything Eleanor had warned her about, against the cold suspicion in Lady Margaret's eyes, against the unsettling presence of Vincent Hale lingering at the edges of the hall. Yet beneath all of it, something in her wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that perhaps not every kindness came wrapped in hidden motives. You may, she said finally. As her carriage pulled away from the estate, Clara glanced back one final time. Nathaniel stood at the top of the stone steps, watching until the carriage disappeared into the darkness. Behind him, framed in a lit window, Lady Margaret watched as well, her expression unreadable, though her stillness carried a warning of its own. And somewhere near the stables, unnoticed by either of them, Vincent Hale watched the carriage depart with a small, satisfied smile, already turning over the pieces of a plan that had only just begun to take shape. The summons arrived 3 days later, carried by a servant in Ashford livery who delivered it with a formal bow and no explanation. Clara read the note twice before fully understanding its meaning. Lady Margaret Ashford requested her presence at the estate that afternoon, alone, without her aunt or cousin in attendance. The tone of the letter was polite on its surface, each word chosen with careful precision, yet Clara could sense the command hidden beneath the courtesy. This was not an invitation, it was an instruction. Her aunt, a practical woman named Margaret Bell, though everyone simply called her Aunt Bell to avoid confusion with the Ashford matriarch, read the letter over Clara's shoulder with a frown creasing her forehead. This does not sound like a friendly visit, Aunt Bell said. Perhaps you should decline. One does not decline a summons from the Countess of Ashford, Clara replied, folding the letter carefully. Whatever she wishes to say, I would rather hear it directly than wonder about it for the rest of my days. The carriage that arrived to collect her that afternoon was simple, unmarked, nothing like the grand vehicles that had carried guests to the banquet 3 nights earlier. Clara understood the message embedded in that small detail. This visit was not meant to be seen. She was led not to the grand receiving room where guests were typically entertained, but to a smaller study tucked away in a quieter wing of the estate, its walls lined with old books and portraits of stern ancestors watching from gilded frames. Lady Margaret sat behind a wide desk, her posture straight, her expression composed into something that revealed nothing of her intentions. Sit, please, Lady Margaret said, gesturing to a chair positioned across from the desk. Clara sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap, refusing to let her nervousness show despite the tightness gathering in her chest. I imagine you understand why I have asked you here, Lady Margaret began, her voice calm and measured, the tone of someone accustomed to controlling every conversation she entered. I have some idea, Clara said, though I would rather hear it from you than guess. Lady Margaret studied her for a long moment before continuing. My son has taken an interest in you, an interest I find both surprising and, frankly, troubling. Nathaniel is not a foolish man, but even wise men make foolish choices when their hearts grow involved before their minds have properly considered the consequences. I have not asked for his attention, Clara said. I have simply accepted the kindness he chose to offer. Kindness, Lady Margaret repeated, the word carrying faint disdain. Kindness is a luxury afforded to those who can bear its cost. My son cannot afford sentiment, Miss Whitmore. Our family's finances are not what they once were. The estate carries debts that grow heavier each season, debts that can only be resolved through a marriage that brings wealth or land into this family, not through a romance with a woman who possesses neither. Clara absorbed the words silently, though they landed with the precision of a blade aimed directly at her chest. I understand your concerns, she said finally, but I did not seek your son's attention for gain, and I will not pretend to apologize for feelings I have not yet even claimed to possess. Then perhaps you should consider withdrawing before those feelings take root, Lady Margaret said. For both your sakes, my son is bound by duty, whether he wishes to acknowledge it or not. If you truly care for him, even a little, you would spare him the burden of choosing between his heart and his family's survival. The words struck harder than any insult Clara had endured at the banquet. There was no cruelty hidden in them, no mockery, only a cold, practical truth that Clara could not easily dismiss. She had seen enough of the world to know that love rarely triumphed over necessity, no matter how deeply either party wished otherwise. I will consider your words carefully, Clara said quietly, rising from her chair. Thank you for speaking to me directly, rather than through whispers and rumors. Lady Margaret's expression softened, just slightly, something almost like respect flickering behind her composed mask. "You are not what I expected, Miss Whitmore," she said. "That does not change my position, but I will admit, it complicates it." Clara left the estate that afternoon with a heaviness she had not carried before, a weight settling deep in her chest as the unmarked carriage carried her back toward home. Lady Margaret's words repeated themselves over and over in her mind, each repetition sharpening their edge. She had spent her whole life learning to expect little, to guard herself against disappointment, and now, for the briefest moment, she had allowed herself to hope for something more. Perhaps it was time to retreat back into the safety of low expectations before that hope cost her more than she could afford to lose. She did not send word to Nathaniel over the following days. When his letters arrived, she left them unanswered, though she read each one twice before folding them away in a drawer she rarely opened. His words were warm, patient, asking nothing more than the chance to see her again, yet each letter only deepened the ache of her decision to withdraw. On the fourth day, he arrived at her door himself. Aunt Belle answered the knock, her eyebrows rising in surprise at finding the Earl of Ashford standing on their modest doorstep, his carriage waiting on the narrow street behind him. "I apologize for the intrusion," Nathaniel said, removing his hat respectfully. "I only wish to know if Miss Whitmore is well. I have not heard from her since the banquet, and I feared something might be wrong." Clara appeared behind her aunt, her heart tightening at the sight of him standing there, uncertain and earnest in a way she had not expected from a man of his rank. "I am well," she said. "I simply thought it best to step back, given the circumstances." "May I speak with you?" he asked. "Privately, if your aunt does not object." Aunt Belle glanced between them, then nodded and retreated into the house, leaving the door open behind her as a quiet gesture of propriety. Clara stepped outside, the cool afternoon air settling around her as she faced him. "Your mother summoned me," she said, deciding honesty was the only path worth taking. "She explained your family's circumstances, the debts, the need for a marriage that serves the estate rather than the heart. I understand her position, Nathaniel. I will not be the reason your family's survival is put at risk." His jaw tightened, frustration flashing briefly across his face. "My mother had no right to summon you without my knowledge," he said. "Whatever she said to you, it does not reflect my own wishes." "But it reflects the truth of your circumstances," Clara said gently. "I would rather step away now, before either of us grows too attached to something that cannot survive the weight placed against it." Nathaniel stepped closer, his expression earnest. "Let me decide what I can and cannot survive," he said. "I am not a boy blindly chasing infatuation, Clara. I have watched my family navigate difficult circumstances for years. I understand duty as well as anyone, but duty without any joy, any genuine connection, is not a life I wish to live simply to satisfy old debts and older expectations." "Your mother believes otherwise," Clara said. "My mother believes many things," he replied. "Some of them true, some of them shaped by fear rather than wisdom. I will not pretend our family's finances are not a real concern, but I will not sacrifice every chance at genuine happiness simply because caution demands it." Clara studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the calculation she had seen in Vincent Hale's eyes, any hint that his words were merely performance. She found none, only quiet sincerity, the same steady honesty that had drawn her to him in the first place. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly, "not of you, but of what accepting your attention might cost us both. I would rather face that fear together than retreat from it separately," he said. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching carriage drew both their attention. A grand vehicle, far more ornate than Nathaniel's own, rolled to a stop along the narrow street, drawing curious glances from neighbors who rarely witnessed such spectacle in their quiet corner of town. A tall man stepped out, dressed in fine clothing that spoke of considerable wealth, his expression carrying the easy confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention wherever he went. Nathaniel's posture stiffened slightly at the sight of him. "Edmund," Nathaniel said, his tone carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." Duke Edmund Carlisle offered a broad smile, though something calculating flickered behind his eyes as his gaze shifted toward Clara. "Nathaniel, old friend," he said warmly. "I heard whispers of a certain banquet 3 nights past, and I simply could not resist seeing for myself the woman who has caused such delightful chaos among the county's finest families." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks under his frank appraisal, though she kept her expression composed. "Your Grace," she said with a polite curtsy. "Miss Whitmore," Edmund said, taking her hand and bowing over it with exaggerated courtesy. "The rumors do not do you justice. I can see now why Nathaniel abandoned his own table to sit beside you. Nathaniel's expression darkened slightly. Edmund, he said, a note of warning in his voice. What brings you here, truly? Edmund's smile widened, unbothered by his friend's tone. Can an old friend not simply pay a visit? He asked innocently, though his eyes told a different story entirely. Besides, I find myself curious about Miss Whitmore. Perhaps she would care to join me for a walk through town, allow me the pleasure of her company, while you attend to whatever business first brought you to her doorstep. Clara glanced at Nathaniel, sensing the sudden tension crackling between the two men, an old rivalry surfacing beneath polite words and easy smiles. I appreciate the invitation, Your Grace, she said carefully, though I believe I am already engaged in conversation this afternoon. Edmund's eyes flickered with something like amusement, or perhaps calculation, though he inclined his head graciously. Of course, he said. Another time, then. I do not give up easily, Miss Whitmore, but I know when patience serves better than persistence. He returned to his carriage, though not before offering Nathaniel a knowing glance, one that carried unspoken challenge beneath its casual surface. As the carriage pulled away, Nathaniel released a slow breath, tension visible in his shoulders. He has always enjoyed provoking me, Nathaniel said quietly, though I do not appreciate him doing so at your expense. Is he truly interested in me? Clara asked, or simply interested in unsettling you? Perhaps both, Nathaniel admitted. Edmund rarely does anything without at least two purposes behind it. Regardless, I would ask you to be cautious around him. He is charming, but charm is not the same as sincerity. Clara nodded slowly, filing the warning away alongside her earlier unease regarding Vincent Hale. The evening at the banquet had introduced two men into her life, both circling her with intentions she could not fully decipher, both arriving with smiles that did not entirely reach their eyes. Despite everything, despite Lady Margaret's warning and Edmund's unsettling arrival, Clara found herself unwilling to fully withdraw from Nathaniel's company. Something about his steady presence, his willingness to stand beside her despite the cost, made the fear worth facing rather than avoiding. Will you walk with me? He asked, extending his hand once more, this time without the grandeur of a banquet hall or the weight of 100 watching eyes, only the quiet street and the fading afternoon light. She took his hand. Vincent Hale arrived at Clara's door 2 days later, unannounced, carrying a leather folder tucked beneath his arm, and an expression far more serious than the easy charm he had worn at the banquet. Aunt Belle answered the door with obvious reluctance, having already formed her own suspicions about the man after hearing Clara's account of his strange behavior that evening. She showed him into the modest sitting room with clipped politeness, and remained standing near the doorway rather than leaving them alone. Miss Whitmore, Vincent said, offering a small bow. I apologize for arriving without notice, but the matter I wish to discuss did not seem suited to letters. What matter would that be? Clara asked, remaining standing rather than inviting him to sit. He opened the leather folder and withdrew a stack of papers, their edges worn and yellowed with age. Your father, he said, Edward Whitmore. I mentioned at the banquet that I knew him through business circles, though that was not entirely true. I knew him through a different matter entirely, one involving a piece of land your father purchased many years ago, before financial troubles forced him to abandon most of his holdings. Clara's brow furrowed. My father left nothing behind but debts, she said. Whatever land you speak of, it was likely sold long before his passing. Not entirely sold, Vincent said, stepping closer and holding out the papers for her to examine. A small parcel remained in his name, overlooked in the settling of his estate due to a clerical error that has only recently come to light. The land itself holds little value on its own, but it sits adjacent to a larger estate currently under dispute, one that several families have quietly sought to claim for years. Your inheritance, though modest in appearance, could prove quite valuable to the right buyer. Clara took the papers cautiously, scanning the unfamiliar legal language, the faded signatures, the official seals she could not fully interpret. Why are you telling me this? She asked, though a cold suspicion had already begun forming in her mind. Vincent's smile returned, though it did not reach his eyes. I believe in fairness, Miss Whitmore, he said smoothly. It seemed wrong to let such an opportunity pass you by, simply because the paperwork had been forgotten. I would be happy to assist you in reclaiming what is rightfully yours, for a modest consideration, of course, given the time and effort such matters require. There it was, the true purpose beneath his carefully constructed courtesy. Clara set the papers down on a nearby table, her expression carefully neutral despite the unease coiling tighter in her chest. And what consideration would you require? She asked. A partnership, he said. I handle the legal complexities, the negotiations, the transfer of ownership, while you provide the necessary signatures and cooperation. In exchange, we split whatever value the land ultimately brings once sold to the interested parties. A fair arrangement, given that without my knowledge, you would likely never have learned of this inheritance at all. Aunt Belle, still standing near the doorway, spoke up sharply. And how did you come to possess such detailed knowledge of a stranger's forgotten inheritance? She asked, suspicion evident in her tone. Vincent's composure flickered, just slightly, before he recovered. I have connections within the county's legal offices, he said smoothly. Old friendships prove useful in matters such as this. Clara studied him carefully, weighing his words against the unease that had followed her since their first strange meeting at the banquet. I will need time to consider your offer, she said finally. And I would prefer to have these papers reviewed by someone I trust before agreeing to anything. Vincent's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, though he masked it quickly with another practiced smile. Of course, he said, though I would caution against delay. Opportunities such as this rarely wait patiently for careful consideration. He left shortly after, though the papers remained on the table, a physical reminder of the uncertainty he had introduced into her already complicated life. Clara sat staring at them long after his carriage had disappeared down the street, questions circling her mind without clear answers. She sent word to Nathaniel that same evening, uncertain whether the matter warranted his involvement, yet unwilling to face it entirely alone. He arrived the following morning, his expression grave as he examined the documents Vincent had left behind. This does not look right, he said after several minutes of careful study. The seals here are inconsistent with proper county records, and this signature, he added, pointing to a faded scrawl near the bottom of one page, does not match the handwriting on the other documents. Someone has altered these papers or fabricated them entirely. Clara's stomach tightened. Why would he go through such trouble, she asked. What could he possibly gain from deceiving me over a piece of land that may not even exist? Nathaniel's jaw tightened, a calculating look settling over his features. I do not yet know, he said, but I intend to find out. Allow me to make some inquiries. I have connections within the county records office who can verify whether any such inheritance truly exists, and whether Vincent Hale has any legitimate claim to knowledge of it. Over the following days, Nathaniel pursued the matter with quiet determination, visiting the county archives personally, questioning clerks and solicitors who might have crossed paths with Vincent Hale in the past. What he uncovered painted a troubling picture, one far removed from the respectable businessman Vincent had presented himself to be at the banquet. He returned to Clara's home nearly a week later, his expression carrying the weight of what he had learned. Vincent Hale is not who he claims to be, Nathaniel said without preamble, once they were seated in the quiet sitting room. His real name is Vincent Cole. He has operated under several aliases across neighboring counties, always employing the same scheme, approaching vulnerable women with fabricated inheritance claims, convincing them to sign documents that transfer property or funds into his control before disappearing entirely, leaving his victims with nothing but worthless paperwork and shattered trust. Clara felt a cold chill settle over her despite the warmth of the room. And my father's land? She asked quietly. Was any of it real? There was no land, Nathaniel confirmed gently. Your father's estate was settled fully at the time of his passing, exactly as you always understood it to be. Vincent fabricated the entire story, likely after learning of your father's passing through public records, then crafting a scheme designed specifically to exploit your circumstances. Anger rose within Clara, sharp and sudden, replacing the earlier unease with something firmer, more resolute. He sought me out deliberately, she said, not out of any genuine interest, but because he saw an opportunity to deceive someone he believed vulnerable enough to trust him. I am sorry, Nathaniel said quietly. I wish I had uncovered this sooner, before he had the chance to approach you at all. You could not have known, Clara said, though gratitude softened the edge in her voice. Thank you for uncovering the truth before I made any mistake I could not undo. Nathaniel reached across the small distance between them, taking her hand gently. What will you do now? He asked. I will confront him, Clara said firmly. He deserves to know that his scheme has failed, and that I will not be made a fool simply because he believed my circumstances left me without allies willing to help uncover the truth. You will not face him alone, Nathaniel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Whatever confrontation comes, I intend to stand beside you through it. Clara studied him for a long moment, gratitude and something warmer settling in her chest, despite the anger still simmering beneath the surface. Thank you, she said softly, for believing me, for taking the time to uncover what I could not have discovered on my own. I would do far more than that, he said quietly, "if you would allow it." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the troubles surrounding them, Vincent's deception, Lady Margaret's warnings, Edmund's unsettling interest, all faded into the background, leaving only the quiet certainty passing between them, unspoken yet undeniable. But the confrontation still waited ahead of them, and with it, the risk of exposing Vincent's true nature publicly, a risk that would carry consequences neither of them could fully predict. The invitation to the county's autumn ball arrived at Clara's door within days, an event hosted by Duke Edmund Carlisle himself, gathering nearly every prominent family within the region beneath his estate's grand ballroom. Clara suspected Vincent Cole would attend, drawn by the same opportunities for deception that had brought him to the earlier banquet, and she resolved to confront him there, in front of witnesses who could not later dismiss the truth as mere rumor. Nathaniel agreed to accompany her, though he insisted on careful preparation beforehand. Together with a solicitor familiar with fraud cases across the county, they gathered evidence of Vincent's true identity, testimonies from previous victims in neighboring counties, records confirming his use of multiple aliases, and the fabricated documents themselves, their inconsistencies now clearly marked and explained. The ballroom that evening glittered beneath countless candles, their light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and polished floors, the entire hall humming with music and conversation, as the county's finest families gathered in their most elegant attire. Clara wore a deep blue gown, a gift from Nathaniel that she had initially hesitated to accept, though he had insisted it was simply a token of respect rather than an attempt to buy her affection. Lady Margaret arrived early, her expression carrying the same careful composure she wore for every public gathering, though her eyes narrowed slightly upon spotting Clara entering on Nathaniel's arm. She said nothing at first, merely watching from a distance as the evening began to unfold. Duke Edmund greeted them warmly at the entrance, his eyes lingering appreciatively on Clara's gown before shifting toward Nathaniel with a knowing smile. "I see you have brought your delightful companion once again," he said. "I do hope this evening proves less eventful than the last." "I would not count on that," Nathaniel replied evenly, his gaze already scanning the crowd for any sign of Vincent Cole. They found him near the refreshment tables, engaged in easy conversation with a young widow whose wealthy family had recently inherited a substantial fortune. Clara felt her anger sharpen at the sight, recognizing the same practiced charm he had once directed toward her now aimed at another unsuspecting target. "We should wait for the right moment," Nathaniel said quietly, his hand resting reassuringly at the small of her back. A public confrontation carries more weight when timed carefully, and with full attention already gathered. That moment arrived nearly an hour later, as the orchestra paused between dances and guests gathered near the center of the ballroom for the evening's formal toasts. Duke Edmund stood upon a small raised platform, preparing to offer his customary welcome to the assembled guests, when Nathaniel stepped forward, requesting a brief moment to address the gathering. Edmund, surprised but curious, gestured for him to proceed. Nathaniel climbed the platform, Clara standing just behind him, the solicitor holding the gathered evidence close at hand. The room quieted, guests turning their attention toward the unexpected interruption with visible curiosity. "Forgive the intrusion upon this evening's celebrations," Nathaniel began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed ballroom. "But a matter of some urgency requires this gathering's attention, particularly given how many families here present have welcomed a certain gentleman into their homes and confidence over recent months." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as guests exchanged curious glances, trying to anticipate where this unexpected address might lead. Vincent Cole, standing near the refreshment tables, went visibly pale, his easy composure cracking for the first time since Clara had known him. "The man many of you know as Vincent Hale," Nathaniel continued, "is in truth named Vincent Cole, a man who has traveled through several neighboring counties employing the same deceptive scheme, approaching vulnerable women with fabricated inheritance claims, convincing them to sign away funds or property before disappearing entirely, leaving behind nothing but forged documents and broken trust." Gasps echoed through the ballroom, heads turning toward Vincent, whose face had drained of all color, his eyes darting toward the exits as though calculating his chances of escape. "I have evidence," Nathaniel continued, gesturing toward the solicitor who stepped forward with the gathered documents, testimonies from previous victims, records confirming his aliases, and the fabricated papers he presented to Miss Whitmore here present. Papers proven false through careful examination against genuine county records. The young widow Vincent had been courting stepped back from him instinctively, horror and betrayal flashing across her face as the truth settled over the gathering. "Vincent," she whispered, "is this true?" Vincent's composure shattered entirely, his practiced charm replaced by desperate panic. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice rising, "an attempt to discredit me out of jealousy, nothing more. The Earl simply wishes to remove any competition for Miss Whitmore's affection." Clara stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I have no affection for you to compete over, Mr. Cole," she said clearly, her words carrying across the silent ballroom. "You approached me with lies, crafted a false inheritance to manipulate my trust, and hoped to exploit my circumstances for personal gain. The Earl uncovered your deception not out of jealousy, but because he cared enough to protect me from a man who preys upon those he believes too vulnerable to fight back." The ballroom erupted into a wave of murmurs and gasps, guests turning toward one another in shocked conversation as the full weight of the revelation settled over them. Vincent looked around desperately, searching for any ally among the gathered crowd, finding only cold, judging stares in return. "You will find no welcome remaining in this county," Duke Edmund said, stepping forward with an authority that silenced the murmuring crowd. "I suggest you leave before the local magistrate is summoned to discuss these matters more formally." Vincent's shoulders slumped, defeat replacing his earlier bravado. Without another word, he pushed through the crowd and disappeared into the night, his carriage pulling away from the estate in visible haste, never to be seen in the county again. The ballroom slowly returned to its previous rhythm, though whispered conversations about the evening's dramatic revelation continued to ripple through every corner of the hall. Clara felt the weight of relief settle over her, the lingering unease that had followed her since Vincent's first approach, finally dissolving into something lighter, freer. Lady Margaret approached slowly, her expression carrying an emotion Clara had not seen from her before, something closer to genuine respect than the cold suspicion she had worn during their previous meeting. "That took considerable courage," Lady Margaret said quietly, once she stood before Clara. "To confront such a man publicly, knowing the risk to your own reputation should the accusation have proven false. I would rather face public scrutiny than allow him to deceive another innocent woman," Clara replied honestly. The truth was worth the risk. Lady Margaret studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her composed expression. "I confess," she said finally, "I misjudged you, Miss Whitmore. I saw only your circumstances, your lack of fortune and title, and assumed those details defined your worth entirely. Tonight you have shown a strength of character that few in this hall, myself included, could claim to possess." Clara felt tears gather unexpectedly at the unexpected warmth in Lady Margaret's words. "Thank you," she said softly. "Your concerns were never unreasonable, only born from love for your son and worry for your family's future. I understand that now more than I did before." Lady Margaret's expression softened further, something almost like a smile touching her lips. "Perhaps," she said, "we might begin again, without the shadow of misunderstanding hanging between us." "I would like that," Clara said. Nathaniel watched the exchange with visible relief, stepping forward once the two women had finished speaking. He took Clara's hand gently, his eyes carrying an intensity she had not seen from him before, even during their earlier private conversations. "I have watched you face every obstacle placed before you with grace and courage I have rarely encountered," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the surrounding crowd. "Tonight, in front of everyone who once doubted your worth, I wish to make my intentions known plainly, without further hesitation or hidden meaning." Clara's heart raced as he continued, guests around them beginning to notice, conversations quieting once more as attention shifted toward the unfolding moment. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I do not offer you wealth or title as reasons to accept my affection, for I know you have never sought such things. I offer instead my genuine admiration, my respect for your honesty, in a world too often built on pretense, and my hope that you might allow me the privilege of courting you properly, without shadows or secrets standing between us any longer." The ballroom held its breath, every eye fixed upon the two of them, waiting for her response. Clara looked into his eyes, finding only sincerity, the same steady warmth that had drawn her to him from their very first conversation at the banquet 3 weeks earlier. "I accept," she said softly, though her voice carried clearly enough for those nearby to hear. The ballroom erupted into applause, guests who had once whispered judgment now offering genuine warmth and celebration at the unexpected romance unfolding before them. Duke Edmund, watching from nearby, offered a rueful smile, accepting defeat in whatever quiet rivalry he had hoped to pursue, though his expression carried genuine happiness for his old friend nonetheless. As the orchestra resumed its music and guests returned to dancing and conversation, Nathaniel led Clara onto the floor once more, this time without the earlier uncertainty that had marked their first dance together. She moved through the steps with newfound confidence, her earlier fear replaced entirely by quiet joy. Lady Margaret watched from the edge of the ballroom, her expression carrying something Clara had never expected to see directed toward her, genuine warmth and, perhaps, the beginnings of acceptance. Winter settled over the county slowly, frost creeping across the fields surrounding the Ashford estate, transforming the grounds into a quiet landscape of pale silver and soft gray. Within the walls of the great house, however, warmth had grown steadily since the night of the autumn ball, a warmth that had little to do with the fires burning in every hearth. Clara visited the estate often now, no longer arriving through servant entrances or unmarked carriages, but welcomed openly through the grand front doors, greeted by name from staff who had once regarded her with polite indifference and now offered genuine warmth in return. Lady Margaret, though still measured in her manner, had begun including Clara in small family gatherings, tea in the afternoon sitting room, quiet conversations about the estate's history, gradual gestures that spoke louder than any formal declaration of acceptance. Yet challenges remained. The Ashford family's financial troubles, the debts Lady Margaret had spoken of so plainly during their first difficult meeting, had not vanished simply because Vincent Cole's deception had been exposed and Nathaniel's affection had been publicly declared. Clara understood this reality clearly, and it weighed on her even as her relationship with Nathaniel deepened. She raised the matter herself one afternoon, as they walked together through the estate's frost-covered gardens, their breath visible in the cold winter air. "Your mother spoke truthfully about your family's circumstances," Clara said carefully. "I do not bring wealth or land to ease those burdens. I worry sometimes that my presence, however welcome it has become, does little to solve the very real difficulties your family faces." Nathaniel stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression earnest. "Wealth can be earned," he said. "Debts can be managed through careful planning and honest effort, neither of which requires sacrificing genuine happiness for the sake of convenience. I have already begun discussing changes to the estate's management with my mother, adjustments that will address our finances without requiring a marriage built on calculation rather than affection." Clara studied him, searching for any trace of doubt behind his confident words. "And your mother agrees to this?" she asked. "My mother has come to understand something important over these past months," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "She has watched you face humiliation, deception, and public scrutiny, with more grace and courage than most nobility could ever claim. She has realized, I believe, that character matters more than fortune when building a life meant to last beyond a single generation." As if summoned by the conversation itself, Lady Margaret appeared at the garden's edge, wrapped warmly against the winter chill, her expression carrying a softness that had grown increasingly familiar over recent weeks. "I did not mean to interrupt," she said, approaching slowly. "Though I confess, I overheard enough to know you were discussing matters close to my own thoughts." Clara straightened slightly, old habits of caution still lingering despite the genuine warmth that had grown between them. "Lady Ashford," she began. "Please," Lady Margaret interrupted gently. "I believe, given everything we have shared these past months, you might simply call me Margaret, at least when we are not surrounded by formal company." The offer carried weight far beyond its simple words, and Clara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. "Margaret." Lady Margaret's expression grew more serious as she continued. "I owe you an apology," she said. "When we first met, I judged you harshly, based entirely on circumstances beyond your control. I feared for my son's future, for our family's survival, and in that fear, I failed to see the qualities that truly matter: honesty, courage, and genuine kindness, freely given, without expectation of reward." "You need not apologize," Clara said. "Your concerns came from love for your son, and I understood that even when your words wounded me." "Perhaps," Lady Margaret said, "but understanding does not erase the pain caused, and I wish to acknowledge that plainly, without excuse or deflection. I have watched you these past months, watched how you have handled every difficulty placed before you, and I find myself grateful, truly grateful, that my son found the courage to leave his table that evening and sit beside you." Nathaniel reached for Clara's hand, his eyes carrying quiet pride, as his mother's words settled over them. "I have long hoped you two might find common ground," he said. "We have found more than common ground," Lady Margaret said, a genuine smile finally breaking through her composed exterior. "I have found, I believe, a daughter I did not expect to gain, but one I am grateful to welcome nonetheless." The words brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes, tears she did not bother to hide. After months of uncertainty, of navigating suspicion and deception and public scrutiny. The simple warmth of genuine acceptance felt like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. Nathaniel knelt then, unexpectedly, drawing a small velvet box from his coat pocket, his hands steady despite the emotion visible in his expression. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet garden. "I have known since that first evening at the banquet that you possessed a strength and honesty I had never encountered in all my years navigating society's expectations. I do not offer you this ring as a symbol of wealth or status, but as a promise that whatever challenges we face together, financial or otherwise, we will face them as equals, as partners who choose each other freely, without pretense or calculation." Clara's hands trembled as she looked into his eyes, finding only sincerity and genuine love reflected back at her. "Will you marry me?" he asked simply. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Yes, I will marry you." Lady Margaret watched with visible joy as Nathaniel rose and embraced Clara, the winter garden around them suddenly feeling far warmer than the season should have allowed. "This is wonderful news," Lady Margaret said, wiping tears of her own from the corners of her eyes. "We must begin preparations immediately. There is so much to arrange." Word of the engagement spread quickly through the county, carried by servants and guests who had witnessed Nathaniel's public declaration at the autumn ball months earlier, and now delighted in seeing that declaration formalized into genuine commitment. Eleanor Grant, who had spent months distancing herself from Clara out of embarrassment and social anxiety, arrived at the estate shortly after hearing the news, her expression carrying genuine remorse. "I owe you an apology as well," Eleanor said quietly, once they found a private moment together. "I treated you poorly at the banquet, ashamed of our connection simply because society had taught me to value status over kindness. I am sorry, Clara, truly sorry." Clara studied her cousin for a long moment before offering a warm smile. "We were both taught different lessons by circumstance," she said. "I forgive you, Eleanor. I only hope you might learn, as I have, that worth is measured by character rather than the opinions of a crowded ballroom." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she embraced her cousin, the old distance between them finally beginning to dissolve into something warmer, something closer to genuine family. As winter gave way slowly to the first signs of spring, preparations for the wedding continued steadily, though Clara insisted on a celebration that reflected both families equally, rather than the grand excess typically expected of noble unions. Lady Margaret, initially hesitant about departing from tradition, eventually embraced the idea wholeheartedly, recognizing in it the same quiet strength that had drawn her son to Clara in the first place. The wedding itself took place on a bright spring morning, the estate's gardens finally shedding their winter frost in favor of blooming flowers and fresh green grass. Guests gathered from across the county, many of them the same faces who had once whispered judgment at the autumn banquet, now offering genuine celebration for the couple whose love had weathered scandal, deception, and doubt to arrive at this joyful conclusion. Following the ceremony, a grand banquet was held within the very hall where their story had first begun months earlier. This time, however, there was no empty seat tucked away near a cold, drafty window, no whispered judgments about poor relations or unsuitable company. Clara sat at the head of the table beside her husband, no longer an outsider glancing nervously at a room full of strangers, but the Countess of Ashford, welcomed fully into a family and a community that had finally learned to see her true worth. Lady Margaret rose during the celebration, raising her glass toward the gathered guests. "To my son," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "and to my daughter, Clara, who taught this family that true worth has nothing to do with fortune or title, and everything to do with courage, honesty, and the quiet strength to remain true to oneself, despite every obstacle placed in the way." The hall erupted into applause, glasses raised in celebration, and Clara felt Nathaniel's hand find hers beneath the table, warm and steady, exactly as it had been since that first unexpected evening, when he left his table to quietly join her. A year passed since the wedding, and the Ashford estate had changed in ways few could have predicted the night Clara first walked through its grand doors as an overlooked guest seated near a drafty window. The financial troubles that had once weighed so heavily upon Lady Margaret's shoulders had eased considerably, thanks in part to careful management reforms Nathaniel had implemented alongside his mother, and in part to Clara's own quiet influence. She had brought with her a practical understanding of accounts and modest living, skills learned through years of necessity rather than privilege, and those skills proved surprisingly valuable in managing a great estate's resources wisely rather than wastefully. On a warm afternoon in early autumn, almost exactly 1 year after that fateful banquet, Clara stood in the same garden where Nathaniel had once knelt to ask for her hand, watching the estate staff prepare for another gathering, though this one carried far less anxiety than the grand events of the previous year. Margaret approached slowly, her steps a little slower than they had once been, though her eyes carried the same warmth that had grown steadily since that difficult first meeting in her private study. "You look thoughtful," Margaret observed, settling onto a garden bench beside her daughter-in-law. "I was remembering," Clara admitted, "how different everything felt a year ago. I arrived at this estate expecting nothing but polite indifference, perhaps quiet cruelty if I was unlucky. I never imagined I would find a family here, let alone a home." Margaret reached over, taking Clara's hand gently. "Nor did I imagine welcoming someone into this family who would teach me so much about the difference between status and true worth," she said. "I spent years believing our family's survival depended entirely on wealth and connections. You showed me, through nothing more than your own quiet courage, that survival built on those things alone is hollow, whereas survival built on genuine character endures far longer." Clara smiled, squeezing her mother-in-law's hand affectionately. "I could not have navigated this past year without your guidance," she said honestly. "You have taught me as much about strength as I ever taught you about worth." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of laughter drifting from the estate's entrance, where Nathaniel had just returned from a morning ride, his cheeks flushed with exercise and cold autumn air. He crossed the garden toward them, his expression carrying the same warmth it always held when his gaze settled on Clara. "I have news," he said, settling beside his wife on the garden bench. "Edmund has finally announced his own engagement, to a young woman he met while visiting relatives near the coast. He claims she reminds him of you, Clara, though I suspect he simply enjoys the idea of following wherever we lead." Clara laughed genuinely at that, remembering the Duke's earlier attempts at courtship, his charm now channeled toward genuine affection, rather than mere provocation. "I am happy for him," she said. "Perhaps he has finally learned that sincerity matters more than performance." "Perhaps," Nathaniel agreed, though his tone suggested amused skepticism regarding his old friend's capacity for genuine change. Eleanor arrived shortly after, her own circumstances having shifted considerably over the past year. No longer burdened by the social anxieties that had once driven her to distance herself from Clara, she had grown into a warmer, more genuine presence within the family, visiting the estate frequently and even assisting Clara in small charitable efforts the young countess had begun establishing throughout the county, providing support for widows and families facing financial hardship similar to what Clara herself had once endured. "I bring good news as well," Eleanor announced, settling into the garden gathering with visible excitement. "The charity fund has grown considerably this quarter. Several families have already benefited from the support, and word continues spreading throughout neighboring counties about the work being done here." Clara felt genuine pride at the news, a project born from her own understanding of hardship now growing into something that touched lives far beyond her own experience. "It is strange," she said thoughtfully, "how a single evening at a banquet, one I nearly did not attend at all, could lead to changes reaching so far beyond anything I could have imagined that night." Nathaniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders gently. "Sometimes the smallest decisions carry the greatest consequences," he said. "I nearly remained at the head table that evening, out of habit rather than genuine desire. Something simply told me to walk toward you instead, though I could not have explained why at the time." "I am grateful you listened to that instinct," Clara said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. As the afternoon light softened into golden evening hues, the family gathered for a quiet dinner within the estate's grand hall, though the atmosphere carried none of the formal tension that had once defined such gatherings. Laughter filled the space instead, genuine conversation flowing freely between family members who had once regarded each other with suspicion and now shared bonds built on mutual respect and affection. Later that evening, after guests had departed and the estate settled into quiet stillness, Clara stood once more near the tall windows of the great hall, gazing out at the darkening gardens beyond. Nathaniel found her there, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin gently atop her head. "Do you ever think about that evening?" he asked quietly. "The banquet, the empty seat, everything that followed?" "Often," Clara admitted. "I think about how easily things might have turned out differently. If you had remained at your table, if your mother's warnings had convinced me to withdraw entirely, if Vincent's deception had gone unnoticed, so many moments where everything could have unraveled. But it did not unravel," Nathaniel said, "because at every turn, you chose courage over fear, honesty over convenience. That is not luck, Clara. That is character, and it has shaped everything that followed, far more than any single decision I made that evening." She turned within his embrace, looking up at him with quiet affection. "We built this together," she said. "Every difficulty, every doubt, every small victory along the way." "We did," he agreed, leaning down to press a gentle kiss against her forehead. "And I intend to keep building beside you, for as long as we both shall live." Outside, the last light of evening faded into soft darkness, stars beginning to appear scattered across the clear autumn sky. Within the estate's walls, warmth lingered in every room, a warmth born not from grand chandeliers or lavish banquets, but from genuine love, hard-won trust, and the quiet courage of a woman who had once sat alone at a grand banquet, waiting for someone, anyone, to see her true worth. She had found far more than acceptance that evening. She had found a family, a purpose, and a love built to last far longer than any single celebration could contain. And as she stood there in her husband's arms, watching the stars emerge above the estate that had become her home, Clara Whitmore Ashford knew, without any doubt, that every hardship along the way had led her exactly where she was always meant to be.